All right. And welcome back, guys, to Self-Selecting Podcast, episode 13. Thank you. Thank you for tuning in. If you are from Spotify, do me a favor, leave me a review. This helps so much. If you're from YouTube, do not forget, please like, comment, subscribe, do it for the algorithm. It helps get the word out. It helps people find this information so they do things better. And that's really the business that we're in, is trying to reduce poor outcomes, whether that be getting on stage or just in general, whether PEDs are involved or not. That is my primary goal, reducing the amount of fuck-ups. That's kind of what we're talking about today. But first, I do want to address this because I realized I made a mistake. Last week, I was like, yo, calendar's open, interested in coaching, one-time consultations. I offer both. Hit me up. I've got plenty of availability. My calendar was not open. Now it is. So yeah, oops, my bad. It was shut off for about 6 weeks. Whether you are looking to get on stage or not, this is something that I can definitely help you with. Whether you are trying to get leaner, whether you're trying to build muscle, whether you were trying to maybe dabble over to the dark side of enhancements, or hey, you know what, maybe you got lab work back and you're just like, this seems like a lot. I don't know where to begin. Let's take a look. For coaching clients, yes, I do review lab work on a regular basis. You can get lab work done as many times as you want. I can definitely recommend where to get it done from. All right, this is gonna be rough if I'm already stumbling over words. A minute and a half in, impressive. Okay. If you're interested in one-on-one coaching, book that call. Let's do a little bit of an introduction, make sure we're a good fit for each other, make sure I can actually help you. One-time consults, that can be something that you seek on your own, or it can be something you and your coach. I have that happen quite a bit, where people will tune in, they'll be like, hey, I already have a coach. I'm super happy. Like, it's a great relationship. I'm not trying to do anything sneaky, but they don't do the lab work. They don't do the enhancements. Can we meet as a group collectively? Can we go over what the plan is and just ensure that nothing is completely wrong, or if there's something that we're missing, like wildly off, let's know before we put things in place. What are we talking about today? Well, I think one of the more popular episodes of this podcast, the one that I think is probably going to get the most traction, is the one where I talk about PEDs. And thus far, we have not talked about PEDs. We have not talked about the female framework for implementing enhancements. Now, I think a lot of people, they kind of get lost in the mix of, well, if I'm not a competitor, should I be considering PEDs? Is that something that there's a justification for me to use? And I mean, frankly, like, it's not my place. It's not anyone's place to tell you, like, no, like, you're not getting on stage. You have no business. Like, okay, I get it. People will say that, like, if your goal is not big enough, you shouldn't use PEDs. Ultimately, you're an adult. I hope this is not a kid-friendly podcast. So you are allowed to make your own decisions. And frankly, I think the counter argument to this is like, okay, just because you're getting on stage, that doesn't necessarily mean that you should be using PEDs. There's a ton of people who get on stage who objectively should not be using any kind of enhancements, yet they do. I think when we approach the conversation around making that transition to using enhancements, for me, this starts with a needs analysis. This starts with determining, okay, what is the goal that you're trying to accomplish? Are you trying to lose body fat? Are you trying to build muscle? If that is the case, if you are maxed out, which we'll talk about how to know if you're maxed out in that department, maybe there's a rationale, but we need context. We need to understand and be very honest about what the specific goal is. The more specific you can be about your goal, the clearer this decision is going to be. The answer will become clear. You can lose fat and you can build muscle without PEDs. This is something that I think is so rudimentary. It is so, like, this should be the first question you ask, is like, where are we headed? And in that case, okay, the consideration around what PEDs could or could not be used, which ones should we like completely toss out, the ones that we just like, they are not going to have a good use for this. That's how we make that decision. First, establishing what is the goal. Now, when we get into the difference between AAS, anabolic androgenic steroids, versus non-AAS, we really have to consider what the need is as opposed to what the risk is. What is the risk of using a non-AAS, a non-anabolic? Within the realm of enhancements, there are two umbrellas. We've got our anabolics and we've got our non-anabolics. We've got the ones that, I'm doing this, that's confusing. We've got our anabolics, in which those will put you at a higher risk of things changing, things that are not reversible at a certain point. That group of non-anabolics, they do not pose that risk. So the amount of people that ask me that, like, yo, like, can I virilize off T3? Like, I just keep seeing virilization pop up. Is this something I need to be worried about? I'm just taking T4, T3. No. Our non-anabolic androgens, those are not ones that are going to put you at risk for virilization. However, there's this like subcategory in the middle of supportive therapies. So our DHEA, boron, we'll even put TRT, which technically falls under the umbrella of anabolics, but in the essence, it is closer to a supportive therapy than it is, let's say, running a cycle of Anavar, Primobolan, Mastron. I'm going to explain. I'm going to get into this, but those ones in that middle category that are truly like the intention is to use it as supportive therapy, they can have effects that are unfavorable. They can have unwanted effects if you're not monitoring your levels, your serum levels of testosterone, a free test of SHBG. If you're not monitoring these things, there can be unwanted effects. So really, let's pull it back, okay? You're interested in making, like, crossing the threshold of like, I've never used anything that Corey talks about on Instagram, but I would like to. I use creatine, I use protein, and I use like L-carnitine. There's a lot of over-the-counter supplements, and people, they often get lost in the weeds of like, well, why are these not considered enhancements? Like, is yohimbine considered a non-androgenic PED? Yeah, okay, we're not going to get into all of that. I'm not going to dissect everyone and be like, well, this technically, like, okay, anabolics, non-anabolics. Your non-anabolics, that is your starting point, unless there's an indication, meaning there's a reason that you need to have supportive therapy in place. Now, when we go through these non-anabolics, got things like clenbuterol, growth hormone, like, yeah, we'll throw in yohimbine, L-carnitine, T4, T3, metformin, telmisartan. Like, we're like really following the black models, and we're like, okay, here's like all the things. That list can be exhaustive because all that is like things that don't work on the androgen receptor. Now, when we shift over, when we talk about those supportive therapies, there is rationale to have them in place as needed. If, let's say, you are someone who your test is low and you're like, listen, okay, like I want to get on stage. I want to be a competitive bodybuilder. I want to take my aspirations, to the highest level. That's a type of person, a type of user that I interact with. It doesn't mean that we need to have that in place off the bat, but realistically, if you're going to be competing on a very frequent basis, and you're going to be exposing yourself and putting yourself, even though like from a health standpoint, it's not healthy, but you're going to put yourself in this state of low energy availability. Okay, maybe there is a rationale to have just a baseline of supportive therapy in place. Now, whether that decision is DHEA and boron, which is really a precursor to supporting your test levels, your free test, it's gonna depend. Which you're gonna hear that 1,000 times this video. It's gonna depend. It's gonna depend on a lot of things. Do you have PCOS? Is your free test already really high? If it is, like, okay, maybe we're not going to fuck with that. Maybe your natural test is already in the 60s, 70s. I don't know. You could be a unicorn. There are people that exist. They're out there. I've met one. I've met one female. I mean, there's couple males I can think of, but one female who her test was in the 60s at like 23. And she's like, yeah, like I'd love to use enhancements. I'm like, girl, you don't need to have the test in place. You're already beating all of this. Like you're better at this, like just genetically. And that is kind of what it comes down to. It's like genetically, like what are the cards that you were dealt? Yes, it's an advantage for sure. And people argue and be like, okay, well, what's the difference then? Like if I support my test levels, does that make me an enhanced athlete? If there are girls that naturally, it's like, why are we splitting hairs? Like, does it really matter? Like holding that title, that label of like, I'm a natural athlete. It's like, I think in the sport itself, I think so much weight is put onto what has been used in order to achieve X results. And what's often convoluted is that in itself, that exclusive, that enhancement compensated for a very poor program, very poor execution on the athlete's part. And that's something I really want to clear up is like, just having it in place, it's not going to do it for you. It's like everyone says that. It's like, it's not going to do the work for you, but I promise you it really fucking won't. Like whether we're talking about non-androgenics, we're talking about like clenbuterol, yohimbine, T4, T3, like you can have them in place, and realistically, if you're not in a deficit, you're not going to lose weight. They're going to be in place, and like you're going to be like, well, yeah, I'm exposing myself to these stimulants and I'm putting myself at a risk for excessive fatigue, potentially. When we're talking about anabolics, though, that risk of using it in a state where you're not able to take advantage of what it's best at, the risk is much, much greater. And that's why we need to have a dialogue around this. That's why I started making videos like around PEDs to begin with. That's why I started talking about this. Like, hey, like, why are we using these things when we can't really take advantage of what they're good at? Like, it's not to say there's not use case, I forget. It's not to say we can't have them in place in that state. Maybe there's rationale, but the prevalence of the anabolic being used in a state where like fat loss is the goal, like everything about your program, you are in a fat loss phase and we're putting this anabolic in place for what? Like for me, the biggest issue I see with this is that you're typically putting this in place with the hope that it's going to create the outcome that you're aiming for, and in that case, like you're in a fat loss phase. It's like, what is the anabolic helping you facilitate? Like what outcome is it facilitating? Because it's not really being utilized to its full potential. The outcome, the goal is to lose body fat, yet you are now exposing yourself to the risk of the development of androgenic side effects just from having it in place, while lacking the capability to really harness the power of what it can do. I'm telling you, like, I think if a lot of people understood that its best use is to build muscle. Yes, they can work on pathways that assist in fat loss. Like, yeah, but I think it's fucking cheap. I think from a coaching perspective, it's like really shitty to promote it that way. Is be like, oh, Anavar will help you like burn fat. It will help you create like a harder look. It's like, yeah, but you're jumping right over the best use for it. You're skipping right over that aspect. Really, I see it being used to compensate for a lack of muscle. And it's not to say that in the appropriate setting for the appropriate client, that having it in place at the end of a fat loss phase, even for a prep client, it's not to say there isn't a use for it. It's just to say it's not a great use. It's not the best way to go about using it. When we pull back and we're like, okay, the goal is to lose body fat, we should be leaning on those non-androgenic PEDs. We should be leaning on things that are going to help us do what we're trying to do. In the off season, we should be leaning on things that are able to help us achieve that goal. And if the goal is not to build muscle, if you are satisfied with your current physique, if you're satisfied with your density, there really isn't a good use for the anabolic. I get clients all the time who are not into competing at all. Like they're just like, that's not my thing. I want to use Anavar. I want to I don't want to build muscle, but I want to use Anavar. I want to use an anabolic. Can we use T-bol? Can we use, like, they have all these ideas around certain drugs that they've heard others have used in order to achieve their physique. And I'm like, we can use them. Like, technically you could put it in place, but do you understand the risk that you're exposing yourself to? And are your expectations, are they calibrated according to what this tool is good for? And I think for a lot of people, it's not. I think the expectations are very vastly different, very skewed. And that's where we need to really establish, okay, what is the need? Well, the needs analysis that, I mean, like I would say with every client that I work with who's interested in being enhanced, we're looking at, okay, like, are you a competitor or are you a non-competitor? This isn't something to say like, oh, if you compete, that is an immediate justification for the use of enhancements. It's not. But I'm certainly going to consider that if someone has very high aspirations in the sport as a whole, if that's something they're like, I'm very set on going pro, and particularly if they're like, I want to go pro in any other division other than bikini, I'm like, okay, well, the minimum buy-in is probably using enhancements, specifically anabolics, because the amount of muscularity required to be competitive in these divisions right now does require that. There's not a set of individuals who just have this secret who are like, oh yeah, but if you do it this way, like, no, like if you're going into wellness, like I'm telling you, like these people, they're athletes, women, they're running a lot to achieve that muscularity. No one's like accidentally guessing their way into wellness. Now, when we consider bikini, it's like, yeah, it's like the minimum buy-in. And I had someone ask me this recently. They were like, hey, what is the risk acceptance for a bikini competitor? Because I get you're saying that, like, which I kind of inadvertently was saying, like, wellness, figure, women's physique, bodybuilding, like these are all ones that frankly, like you can't be highly risk averse, like some degree of acceptance that like you could experience side effects, like unwanted androgenic effects of these drugs. It's kind of what you're signing up for because you were committing to using them frequently. Whereas with bikini, I mean, like, yeah, the muscularity requirements at the pro level, they're pretty great, but it's not completely unattainable. It's not one of those that I'm like, yeah, you're going to be doing this for like 5-10 years, like before you even like make a dent, honestly. I think the minimum buy-in with bikini is really the loss of ovulation. You are going into the sport accepting that like, hey, I'm going to be competing relatively frequently. Even if you take time off in between seasons, it's just the fact of like, okay, I'm going to be getting on stage, and as opposed to not competing. So it's like, okay, if you're not competing, you can always pull back if you begin to lose that ovulatory cycle, and you can decide and be like, okay, I'm not going to continue pushing past a certain point. Whereas in the sport of bodybuilding, specifically with bikini, but all the divisions, if you're getting on stage and like the threshold for you is like, I don't want to lose my period, I don't want to lose my ovulatory cycle, that could be very unrealistic. Just simply because like most people being in that state of low energy availability, it's starvation. They're probably not going to be able to sustain ovulation. Their body is going to override that and be like, no, you can't be trusted. Like this is not a critical function, like fertility, like reproduction. That's not something that's a priority when you can't even take care of yourself. You can't even feed yourself. Now, I think when it comes to the needs analysis, we do have to look at the individual structure. We have to look at the gap in between where they are currently and where they need to be based on that next milestone on stage or off stage. So for the non-competitor, someone who's like, hey, I don't have a lot of muscle mass and I want to achieve a certain degree of muscle mass relatively quickly. Well, depending on what tools they have left to deploy, to leverage, the difference between where you are versus where you want to go. It's really simple to look at like someone who wants to be a pro bikini competitor, look at where they are like starting out, first contest prep ever, and they're like, yeah, I'm gonna need like 10, 15 pounds of muscle. Okay. For them, we explore, we look at, okay, like how long have they spent actively trying to build What was their response to whatever program they're on, whatever like building phase they are following? I think a lot of people jump the gun and they'll just put it in place. They'll just consider, okay, well, this is not something I want to wait for. So regardless of how my program looks, regardless of if my progress is stalled, I'm going to put it in place because I want to be ready in 3 to 6 months. Cool. And 6 months is generous. A lot of people, they're going to want it even sooner. But you gotta really consider, okay, like if we're talking about someone like Maureen, Laura Legion, Dory, it's like, they don't all of them off the bat, I'm like, they don't need any more muscle. And like, if they were told like, oh, you need more muscle, it's like, maybe this is a conditioning thing instead. Maybe it's like, oh, hey, we need to bring you in leaner so you look like you have more muscle. That is a little easier. Someone who is muscled out, who's very dense, versus someone who is under muscled. That's a little bit harder to establish. Okay, what is the effectiveness of having them run a cycle? Because really, like the max you should be, like generally, like the point where it gets a little dicey, it's like, this is excessive. Like 8 weeks ish. Like, I mean, yeah, there are people that will run it a little bit longer. Maybe there's a justification for it, but you're not going to build, like if you need 15 pounds of muscle, you're not building that in 6 to 8 weeks. So the way I think about it, I'm like, well, if you need that degree of muscle, we need to approach this systematically. And that kind of goes back, and this is like separate. I'm like, what is the state that you're in hormonally? And is that state conducive? Is that like dialed in terms of like, are you able to build muscle when you're not on cycle? Because just simply having the anabolic in place, you can have Anavar in place, you can have Primo in place, but if like hormonally, if your test is really low, if you're finding that recovery is pretty shitty, and this is like outside of the training program, outside of the dietary needs, outside of, I mean, recovery, I already said that, but like, if you're finding that you're not building, but you are in a building phase and like you're not growing, performance isn't going up, like performance will go up with a little bit of an anabolic. A small dose performance will go up. But really what is going to be accomplished outside of an increase in training performance if you're not recovering, if you're not eating to support that growth? If you are not in a position then when you come off cycle to essentially like continue seeing out that progress, like in theory, you should have gained strength. You should be able to continue gaining. I mean, assuming you were gaining before, but if you weren't gaining before and it was just something you're like, oh, I don't know. I've stalled. I'm lacking progress in this department. It's like, we should probably clean that up first. We should probably address the root of the issue rather than put something that is high risk, which I'll go over the risk here next, but like put something in place that is high risk, that does have consequences, that as the female athlete, if you put it in, which let's just say like you put it in, but you put in a little too much, you put in the wrong thing, then it's like some of those effects, those androgenic effects, they can be irreversible. So, okay, what are these effects? Because this really is like the thing people really want, like a hard answer on this. They're like, will I virilize taking 5 milligrams of Anavar? Will I virilize taking 50 milligrams of Primo? If we're talking about like, what is the expected androgenic effect of these hormones, of these synthetic compounds? They're not hormones. I need to really be clear about that. They have effects on your hormones. But these anabolics, like, okay, we can't really approach it like buffet style and be like, oh, okay, well, like I want the anabolism, but I don't want the androgenic effects. It's like, yeah, that would be nice. But it's literally, dude, look at the name. Like it's in the name. Anabolic androgenic steroid. So your total lifetime exposure, however many cycles you do at a certain milligram dose, there's a threshold in which you hit that and the risk of these androgenic effects can begin to occur. Now that profile, that ratio of anabolic potential versus androgenic potential, that does vary compound to compound. So steroid to steroid. You take something like Anavar versus Primo versus Mastron versus Winstrol versus nandrolone versus testosterone. Some of these have a higher degree of androgenic potential, meaning you could take seemingly less, yet those side effects, which I'm just going to say side effects, but they're expected effects, those effects are going to be greater. You're going to have a higher likelihood of experiencing virilization. And let me back up, because I know I said I would say this and then I kind of just kept going. What are these expected effects? What are these like signs of virilization? So the big one that like people like, for me, I was like, I do not want this. I don't want either of these. The two that are like highly, highly concerning, that are irreversible, we've got changes in vocal pitch. So the actual thickening of your vocal cords. This one, it's not like, it changes them. And I mean, like, if you don't catch this early, like, it's going to be like that forever. Like, you're not going to be able to walk it back. I mean, like, sure, we can say that maybe you do some speech therapy, maybe I don't know, maybe you get surgery, but like, frankly, a lot of people, they won't notice these effects occur and be like, oh, I just got a little, my throat's a little, I'm just a little congested, except that congestion like doesn't go away. And then over time, a little bit deeper until, and I mean, like, the internet is fucked. Like, people will put like videos. I've seen girls in like Reddit and stuff. They'll take videos of like a girl from like 4 years ago. And like now they'll be like, listen, like, do you hear the difference? Like, she totally virilized. It's really shitty. I mean, like, but it also is a good learning lesson. It's like, if that athlete doesn't realize that they virilized, if they don't hear it themselves, which a lot of the time people will deny that. They will be like, no, like, it's not noticeable. Because, I mean, frankly, it is something that like we're just going to assume is unwanted. We're assuming that if you're taking these anabolics, it's not for the reason of you were trying to incur masculinization. You're not going through a sex change intentionally, but that's essentially what's happening. Now, the other big one that I think is even harder to capture and to see transparency around is clitoral growth, like enlargement, hypertrophy. And this is one, like, I'll tell you, like, I have a girlfriend who, like, she runs a lot of tests. She likes to be in the 400 to 500 nanogram per deciliter. She's like, I like how it feels. She's a bikini. Like, she's not a different category. She's like, yeah, my clit grew. Of course. I don't mind it. It's not something that was important to me. It was not something that I like drew a line around. And frankly, like, when it comes to any kind of anatomical changes, this is not going to be something that you're able to observe. People aren't going to come out. That's a very like vulnerable thing to showcase on social media, let alone admit, even in like environment where, there's a trusted individual. But in a lot of these cases, I mean, you as the viewer, I mean, like, you're hoping to garner this information from, let's say, someone that you look up to, someone that you probably don't have a relationship with, probably someone that you just follow on social media. And in that case, it's going to be very difficult to actually gather whether or not this person has experienced anatomical changes. I mean, that's not something that many people are going to feel comfortable sharing. You have these two, anatomical changes, vocal changes. These are the two that I would say, like, predominantly they are the most concerning, as they're irreversible. But then you have other ones. You have like acne, hair growth, hair loss. I mean, obviously the suppression of hormones. So I mean, like GnRH, like FSH, LH, like these anabolics, like, they will have suppressive effects on these hormones. So I mean, like, you have to know, for someone who's like really keen on like fertility and like, I don't know if I'm going to have problems down the road. I don't know if like I'm in the best position to like naturally carry a child to full term. It's a consideration you need to make. It's something that you need to be mindful of, like having the anabolic in. It's certainly not helping fertility. But on top of being in that state, being in that suppressed state, you stack that with competing frequently, you're not doing yourself any favors. I've laid out the side effects. I've laid out really the consideration around like the division, the goals. So like generally, like, are we using this in the right setting? Which, like, frankly, for most people, what I'm going to say is that the use of an anabolic in a contest prep setting or in a fat loss phase, it's just not appropriate. It's just not the best use for it. Yet you are exposing yourself, yet you're putting yourself at those risks of virilizing side effects, of masculinizing effects. I mean, what we also have to consider is, yes, the dose, the duration, whether or not there truly is an indication to escalate the dose, to seek, a higher dose, to include a higher dose of these compounds. And it's like, I mean, for me, I'm going to say like, I've used 2.5 of Anavar. I've used 5 milligrams of Anavar. There wasn't a performance difference. And I mean, like, there will be people who shit on me for that. I'm like, no, of course, like more drugs, like you will definitely, okay, like I get it. We're also talking about bikini. We're also talking about someone that in the back of my mind, I'm like, I'm doubling my daily dose, because that's daily, 2.5 a day, 5 a day. I'm doubling my daily dose. Am I getting an increase in performance that's justified? I mean, am I actually seeing a 150% increase in performance? No, I'm not. So to me, like, when we're justifying like escalating the dose, that is a whole other component that needs an analysis, that needs a needs analysis. I mean, like time and time again, I'll talk with individuals where I'll be like, hey, I really think we need to start at a lower dose. I think we need to start at 2.5, at 5. I think for, injectables, we need to start at like 15, at 30. And they kind of laugh at me. They're like, it's so much less than I've used previously. Like, how is that going to work? And it's not to say that prior use shouldn't be considered. It absolutely should. But if that prior use was excessive, that also needs to be considered. That also needs to be something that we take into account. I've had girls come to me who, like, they'll show me their stage shots. They'll be like, I was running this. What do you think? And I'm looking at the dose of Anavar and I'm like, the fact that you gained no muscle in a building phase, like you didn't make any kind of improvements season to season, like prep to prep, but you were using a dose that I would say is like triple, 3-4x what I would recommend you starting at. And frankly, if you were starting at 1/3, 1/4 of what you actually ran and you still weren't gaining muscle, I would have serious questions. I'd be like, how shit is your program? Like, how shit is your recovery? Like, what else are you doing? Because somehow you're managing to undo what the anabolic is good at doing in a state where it's supposed to be able to do this. Like, you must be doing a lot wrong. And I know, like, how I'm saying it now, I'd never talk to someone that way. That's very mean. But I do think we need to normalize being direct in that, like, you should be able to gain muscle with this enhancement in place. You should be able to gain muscle without it in place. It should augment those hypertrophy efforts. And if it's not able to do that, it's not an indication that the dose is not high enough. Like, dude, what are you doing? I think when it really comes down to whether or not there's rationale to put it in place, like globally, like as an athlete, are you ready to have this in place? I mean, one of the first questions I have is like, show me your program. Show me your progress. Like, I need to see in a objective manner, I need to see that you have been progressing on your program thus far. And if you haven't been, we need to clean that up first. It's only going to enhance a process that is already taking place. It's not going to create that process for you. It's not going to create a state of anabolism if you were doing things very poorly, if you are not putting yourself, if you're not exposing yourself to the proper stimulus, if you're not fueling yourself, yeah, you know what? There are going to be people that are like, well, I had it in place and I gained muscle in prep. Okay, context. What happened when you pulled it out? Did you go up a few pounds when you put it in? And when you pulled it out, did you go down a few pounds? Because that's typically the complaint I see, is that people are like, oh, I'm worried about how do I PCT so I don't lose muscle. And it's like, you shouldn't lose muscle. If you regress back to your starting point from simply just removing it, you probably didn't build muscle. That was probably not muscle. But that's why it's important to have metrics or have methods in how you track muscle growth. And that's something that, like, if you've listened to previous episodes, like there's a system I have in place. I think it's really important to be able to measure circumference, caliper site, so pinchable body fat, alongside scale weight, not just scale weight once a week, but looking at your average, looking at your high and low, comparing that collectively each month. If you do have fluctuations, if you do have 1 or 2 weeks out of the month where like weight is always up because your cycle, okay, even on an anabolic cycle, even on a cycle of Anavar, on Primo, whatever, we should still see those trends moving in the right direction. And this needs to happen alongside training performance. But if you're not monitoring these things, like if you're not looking at increases in performance, if you're kind of just going off feel, do I feel like I'm getting stronger? Do I collectively know if like I'm using more weight? Well, maybe you'll guess yourself into the right direction and maybe you will yield some muscle growth. But again, it goes back to what is the risk acceptance that you're approaching this with? Are you okay with using this and not getting the full benefit from it? Are you okay with using it and potentially like ending the cycle and being like, yo, like it felt great, but like, I don't know how much actually changed. I don't know how much muscle I built, maybe a pound or two. I mean, like a pound or two of tissue, depending on how big you are, like that could make a significant difference. And frankly, depending on where you're at in your career, I mean, if you're like a national level competitor and you're like, oh, I was so close. Like I was right there at my last national show. Maybe you were 1 or 2 placings away. You put on a pound or two of muscle in the right areas. Maybe that is enough to push you over the edge and to put you in a position where now you are more competitive. But it's not just about the cycle. It's not just about the present cycle. Okay, I'm just doing it this one time. Almost everyone will say, yeah, I'm just going to do this one cycle, see what happens, and hopefully I don't have to use it again. Majority of people like how that feels. They like how it feels to be on drugs because what do you know? They work. So then when you start to consider, okay, well, for the non-competitor, is this going to be something that you kind of passively do like whenever you're bored? Is this going to be something that over time you're kind of drawn back to? You're like, okay, you know what? I feel like my last fat loss phase, I wasn't as dense as I wanted to be. You know what? I should do another cycle. Okay, I want to get ready for this trip. I really want to have a more mature, more developed physique. So, you know, let's go ahead. If you're approaching drug use with that in mind, as a female athlete, you do have to consider, okay, how many times am I going to go through this? And if I'm continuing to expose myself to this drug, am I okay with those potential side effects? Am I okay with things occurring that are technically unwanted? I mean, like I harp on this all the time. I know it's like a lot of my videos is like virilization and understanding the risk because I just don't think people get it. I don't think people understand like how quickly things can change, or on the inverse, how slowly things can change, yet they're like, oh, I didn't get any side effects. No negative, no. The people that come to me who are like, I want to do drugs, and I ask them about their previous cycle, and they tell me, and I'm like, this is a lot. It's a lot for what your needs are. It's a lot for the information that you've provided. And I'm like, what were the effects? Like, well, I built a little bit of muscle. I'm like, okay, any negative effects? And a lot of people, most of the time, are gonna be like, no, nothing. But of these people, like I get on calls with them. I hear their voice. Like there is a certain point where I'd be like, I don't think our definitions of what negative, unwanted effects are, I don't think they're the same, which is okay. It's okay if they're not the same. But if you come to me, or you don't come to me, if you're just like, hey, globally, I don't want to experience any kind of changes, any kind of virilization, you need a method to track when these things potentially could occur. Now, typically what I recommend is if you're going to start a cycle, you should probably establish a baseline from like a vocal pitch. Like I use an app called Voice Analyzer app. That's the actual name of the app. It's something that at the very least, do on a weekly basis prior to starting the cycle, during the cycle, and then post-cycle. I mean, for anatomical changes, like you can take pictures. You can see, are things growing? But the thing is, like, these drugs will feel good. You'll like doing them. I understand it. Like, yeah, I've said this on so many podcasts recently. I'm like, it feels good to take Anavar. Until they can formulate a pre-workout that is as effective as Anavar, I mean, like, and people are going to have a hard time differentiating the feeling and being truly honest about like, well, what happened that I'm not so keen on taking a closer look at. I would track the vocal changes. I would track anatomical changes. If you're someone who already naturally has a very high free test, if you're someone who has PCOS, you need to be considerate of these things because maybe naturally, maybe you already like have some darker facial hair growth. Like just with age, you find that like, yeah, you know what, like whenever I get threaded, whenever I shave, like I'm noticing as I get older, okay, these things like they're starting to shift. If that's the case, well, any anabolic that's going to raise free test, which some of them do, it puts you at a higher risk for these. I mean, like they're reversible, sure, but they're still unwanted. For the most part, they're still unwanted. Acne is another big one. I mean, like the people that I think are at highest risk for this are individuals who have higher free tests, so PCOS. But let's just say you struggled with acne growing up and like maybe you found a method to control it. The amount of people I've seen put on spironolactone like indefinitely, it's just an anti-androgen. Like they're putting it in place literally to minimize the effects, the activity at the androgen receptor. Pretty sure I'm right there. But they're putting it in place alongside an anabolic, or they're putting it in place alongside TRT. It's like we should probably consider the exogenous anabolic, the androgen. We should probably consider whether that should be in place, the duration it's in place, the dose, whether there's something that we can do to modulate free test. Like I'm very fortunate. I didn't struggle with acne growing up. Sure, around my cycle, like maybe I get a few, but it's like, if that's something that really your entire life, it's been an ongoing issue, like I gotta say, like this is something you need to consider because it can be really surprising, especially if you are not aware that like that is an expected effect of these compounds, particularly if free test is already really high. If you're already on the upper end of the range, I would love to give you metrics and be like, okay, if you are at this point, you should probably like, I can't do that. I can't do it honestly, because frankly, it is so individualized. And it's also something that, I mean, like when we're talking about acne particularly, or even hair growth, hair loss, but specifically acne, if that's something that you're experiencing, I mean, it's multifaceted. I mean, it's largely dictated by just overall systemic inflammation. Now, does this increase as you expose yourself to exogenous androgens? Yes. You're in a very high stress state if inflammation as a whole is being managed very poorly, i.e. cardio is really high, micronutrient intake is very poor. You're in this, let's just say a contest prep or an extreme fat loss phase. These are the things that, I mean, as you approach that decision, whether you end up making the decision or not, you at least need to consider them. You at least need to kind of walk through, okay, what is the threshold in which I would no longer use this drug, or I would never consider using this drug. Personally, I like to be very specific. So like for me, I'm like, okay, if my voice changes, that's it. We're done. I'm not going to have something in place that is going to progressively change my voice. If I had anatomical changes, that's not something I want. We're shutting it down immediately. I have to figure something else out because I'm not going to continue down that path. It's not going to be on the table for me anymore. And again, these changes, like they can be so gradual and it can be really hard to want to confront changes if that's something that you have experienced previously and you're like, well, I did, but it wasn't that bad. It's like, like you owe it to yourself to at least be honest about it. If you were going to continue to use said anabolic, if you're going to be in the sport, if you're going to expose yourself if you're going to increase your exposure just from a lifelong perspective, if you plan to do cycles down the road, I think a lot of people are afraid of taking a lower dose and not getting the same effect, or a lot of people are afraid of, potentially going against what their coach says, their, I want to say mentor, but like boyfriend, friend, person of guidance who's telling them this is what you should take. But you should be informed. Like if you're not informed of the risk, how can you really make an informed decision? And that's where I think, really my goal here, my goal for listeners, for you guys, is not to deter you from taking drugs. Like you're an adult. I hope you're an adult. Make the decision that you're comfortable with, make the decision that you can live with. But what I see time and time again is individuals making decisions that frankly, they're in no way prepared to deal with the outcomes, because those outcomes were never explained to them. They never even considered experiencing something that maybe is irreversible, that would actually pull away, that would reduce their, as an individual, their femininity. And I get it. Like, I mean, you see all the glam, you see the hype on social media, you see people doing really well, you see them retaining tissue, and you see them like, allude to, support in place, but they never really talk about it. And then maybe you get with a coach and the coach is like, yeah, this is literally what everyone takes. Like, it's totally safe. And maybe it is totally safe. Maybe what they're recommending does fall within like a safer use framework. Maybe it's exactly what I would recommend. But I think you do have to go in with the presumption that like when you cross that threshold into using anabolics, no anabolic is risk-free. Every anabolic that you use comes with that potential risk. And that includes TRT. TRT has blown up. That's become a thing that now, I mean, across the board, even outside of the sport of bodybuilding, with the rise of the popularity in telehealth services. I mean, like, you have so many private businesses, and if y'all got to stop putting these women into like the low end of male territory. Like, why are you starting someone for low libido or low recovery? Like, why are you starting them at 20 milligrams? Like, to me, it is truly baffling that you have individuals who are not in the sport. They go to a provider with the complaint of, hey, I have low energy. Like, I don't feel as recovered as I do for my workouts. I'm always tired. Oh, my libido is also low. And bam, put them on 20 milligrams a test. That should never happen. If you're going down the TRT route, you do have to know that TRT, like testosterone, is highly virilizing. Testosterone is much more virilizing than our DHT derivatives. And people will say, okay, well, why would we have TRT in place prior to Anavar? Why would we not just do the little cycle of Anavar? Because the appropriate dose of TRT, it's not going to put you in a super physiological range. It's only going to be in place to support normal levels. Now, this dose, I mean, like, compared to your cycle of Anavar, compared to that starting dose, 2.5 milligrams, 5 milligrams a day, we're talking about a starting point, a starting dose for TRT of 0.5 milligram a day. I mean, like, even on the upper end, like 1 milligram a day. Literally, you're comparing like upper end of TRT to, let's just say, a conservative dose of Anavar, which is still not the most conservative, but like 5 milligrams of Anavar a day. That's a big difference. Now, we do have literature. We have really good studies to show the efficacy and the safety profile of TRT as individuals, like within the transgender community. They were trying to achieve these androgenic side effects that we want to avoid. They were trying to achieve, they were trying to incur these side effects. So we can actually see that threshold in which side effects could begin to occur, which, let's be honest, they're probably still occurring very slowly. Like, when you really consider, okay, you've got TRT, that like the starting dose, 0.5 milligram a day. 0.5 milligram, I'm talking about injectable, but like, you compare that to the starting dose of Anavar, the daily dose of Anavar, I mean, like 2.5 milligrams a day, which, I mean, like, for whatever reason, that's something like I feel like a lot of people are like skipping right over. They just go straight to 5 milligrams. That's your starting dose. It's like, that is a significant difference. It's a much, much greater dose. You also have to consider the components. I mean, like, when you take something like Anavar, when you take any kind of anabolic, any ancillary anabolic, it's going to have suppressive effects on your HPO axis. It's going to signal to your body that it doesn't need to produce testosterone, estrogen, progesterone. When we start to consider why TRT would be beneficial, why that would be the starting point for the female athlete, it comes down to, it's going to offer a baseline of supportive therapy. Prior to the inclusion of an ancillary anabolic, it's going to offer stable test levels, that which we can measure in serum. Like, in serum levels, we can measure in lab work. This is a huge advantage, because let's say you do take someone and let's say for whatever reason, they started a little too high. They started at a TRT dose of 10 milligrams a day. Okay, we measure that. We see that that takes them to 115 nanograms per deciliter. It's not to say it always will. Maybe there are some people out there that 10 milligrams a day, that'll be suitable. But let's say it does take them above that normal to normal high range. We can titrate back from that. We can pull that down. You can't do that with Anavar. You have no way of knowing, like, okay, is 10 milligrams going to be too high? Is 20 milligrams going to be too high? Sure, we can theorize, and we can say, well, this athlete took this amount and that resulted in some unwanted side effects. Okay, well, this is a low enough dose, so we can run this for this amount of time. Oops, okay, we're going to run it for an additional 6 to 8 weeks. Now, all of a sudden, we have this 5-month cycle of Anavar, and even though it's at a low dose, when you look at the total exposure from a milligram perspective, like you look at how many milligrams that individual was exposed to, we don't have a way to measure how close someone is to virilizing. Ultimately, this needs to be something that we err on the side of caution if the individual is risk averse, if they are insistent, I do not want to virilize. I would much rather it take a little bit longer and we need to tighten up other areas of the program versus putting it in place and realizing, ooh, kind of overshot. There are some changes that are now occurring that, frankly, like, I didn't anticipate this. I know there are a lot of individuals out there who will nitpick and they'll argue and they'll be like, okay, but I took this and I was at this dose and I didn't experience side effects. Amazing. I'm so happy for you. I'm so happy that you came out of that unscathed. But for every person that's like, oh, I didn't have a bad experience, understand that there's a lot of people who are not speaking up, might not even see videos like this. They might not even be aware that like they've incurred side effects. But there are so many people within the industry, so many women, so many young women who are put into positions where they trusted someone, they took their advice, they exposed themselves to what they thought was a reasonable dose of something. And ultimately, they now have to deal with the consequences that they didn't even know were a possibility. They just took someone's word for it and believed that they would be okay, but they're not. They're not. And at this point, it's like, what do? Do you just do, if you're a bodybuilder, if you're in the sport, it's like, if you had any kind of aspirations, well, now you have to know that like that threshold, it's a very real thing. And if you're going to continue using it in the future, it's more than likely you're going to experience virilization. It's additional exposure. You're closing that gap. And a lot of women, I've had women come to me who are like, you know, hearing your videos now and referencing my last cycle or the last coach I worked with, I'm so glad that I came across this content and I at least now know the next time I'm put in this position where I'm told just take X, Y, and Z at this point in prep or at this dose, well, at least I can make that decision for myself. Is this something I actually want to do? Is this something I'm okay with risking? Can I roll the dice here? Ultimately, it's not my position to tell you what's feminine, what's an acceptable risk, what is a degree of virilization that's too far. I'm a big proponent of you having agency over your decisions and deciding what you would like to do, whether there's a high risk associated. But I think ethically what needs to happen, if there's not a conversation from whoever is like programming you or guiding you, at the very least, you should have the information, you should have the knowledge to know that like what I'm doing is in fact risky. Ultimately, the point of this episode of all the shit I do is just to give people more information so that if they do choose to make a decision and something does happen, that they're not surprised, that ultimately they're aware and accepting of the responsibility that comes with those decisions. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Let me know what you think in the comments below. As always, like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.